So what we wanted to spend this day doing is kind of anchoring in things around the staff parish relations or the parish relations committee. How does the church relate to the pastor, and how do they relate to the superintendent and bishop? We have Heather Duvall from our administrative services office, who will talk about how do we do finances as a church. And David Garvin, our director of administration and our conference treasurer, will be here to talk about trustees and the roles of that, and saying, trying to set some anchors as we go through this uncharted space. When I mention the word Pastor Parish Relations Committee, what's the first thing that pops to mind? Now, be honest. What's that? Paperwork.
Yeah, printer ink.
Hiring. Often while it's not their name, we treat them like the complaint department. We don't talk to them unless we have a complaint. Well, I'm here to say we're not the complaint department. It's often people will say, stay or go. That's their function. Does the pastor stay or go? So often we develop into more of an opinion, discernment of opinions of the church around the pastor staying or going. So we're going to walk through some of that. You have the handouts. If you look ahead, God will know that you're looking ahead. But I want you to have something also to take home. Now, there'll be paragraph numbers and such. I'm not going to focus so much on the paragraph numbers, but on the function. And the very first thing we talk about is that those people who serve on the staff parish, and staff parish if you have staff and clergy, pastor parish if you have your employee is just simply the pastor. But the number one requirement is that they be spiritually growing Christians, because they're that spiritual heartbeat of leadership of the church. So let me say, it's great if you have somebody that's in human resources, but you want someone in human resources who's also committed to their faith and being discipled. It's great to have somebody that manages people. Those are good skills to have, but it needs to be somebody who manages people and they understand their call to follow Jesus. So not just good managers, but good growing disciples of Jesus. This is critical because you're helping your church do spiritual discernment. And I want to distinguish between spiritual discernment and opinion discernment. We do opinion discernment really well in the church, but we're not so good at saying, what's the Spirit calling us to do? And that's a big part of this committee. Now, some of you aren't on that committee and you're wondering, why in the world do I have to know these things? The whole church needs to know the function of these committees we talk about, because everybody will have an image. Or I'm mad at the pastor and you're supposed to fix it, right? I don't know how many chairs of PPR I've had coming on. I didn't realize this could be like people are calling me all day about X. So we often treat you as a complaint department, but that's not all your job. Now, a big part of your role, please laugh at my cartoons. I looked hard to find those. We often see ourselves as defending the church against the pastor when really we're supposed to be encouragers of our pastor, which includes, is she or he taking care of themselves? Sometimes we pastors like to wear as a badge of honor, I've never taken my full vacation, or I don't take a day off. And I'm here to tell you that's a sign of, a dangerous sign in your pastor. So part of your job is to make sure your pastor is taking care of themselves mentally, physically, and spiritually. And when someone complains about, well, she's not in the office today, well, today is her day off. She publishes that. She lets people know. Well, why does she get a day off? She only works one day a week, right? And pastor can't give what a pastor doesn't have. And as Bishop Graves has said recently, it takes healthy pastors to have healthy churches. And so make your pastor take care of themselves. And just recently, we have, by motion of the annual conference, a renewal leave option available, and it's 2020 through 2020.
Wellness leave through the end, from now until the end of 2025.
But if they serve during 20 to 23, the annual conference says they shall get 2 weeks off. That's not their vacation. Because if you think it's tough being church during COVID, imagine being a church leader during COVID. That's one way. If you're on that committee, to ask your pastor, have you applied for that? Well, no. Well, why not? I'm too busy. No, you're not. Again, a pastor cannot lead a healthy congregation if he or she is not healthy themselves. And there's also things like October as Pastor Appreciation Month. I'm kind of sad there's not a district superintendent appreciation month. I don't, but maybe there's a good reason why.
I'm still a pastor.
We're still pastors to somebody. But make sure they celebrate that. Celebrate their appointment. Help the church to say hello well, but also help the church say goodbye well. So often when our pastors move, we fail to really honor their time with us. Even if it was a tough time, God was present. Even if it was a rough time, a rough batch between church and pastor, God still worked through us, in spite of us, to take some time to honor that. And yes, you are to promote unity in the churches. And I'm afraid this may have looked like some of your admin council meetings. I hope not. But I don't mean the Pastor Parish Relations Committee is the referee. What the Pastor Parish Committee's role is helping find healthy ways to disagree with each other. As I had to tell my own grown children, we can disagree and still love each other. So the question is not how do we get everyone to agree, but how do we disagree in love? How do we agree to disagree in love? How do we witness to our community about here's how the church disagrees with each other, which should look a whole lot different than how our politicians disagree with each other. Unfortunately, sometimes we're guilty of there not being much difference. So it's often a witness to the community. And if you don't think your community knows that you're having problems, don't fool yourself. It's often like I served a church that someone said, well, we need to show you where we hide an extra key. And it's a secret place we put it just so you'll know. Okay. So I guarded the secret place, right? Because I didn't want a bunch of people knowing about that until we had a delivery person come in. I said, oh, okay, I'll meet you at the church. And he goes, don't worry, I know where the key is. Well, come to find out the whole county knew where the key was. It's also true the county knows how your church is. So the question often is not how do we get everyone to agree, but how do we make sure we have a good witness to the community of how Christians continue to love each other while disagreeing? How do we talk to each other in love? So yeah, that's part of your problem, so we don't have this. But that's often the image we have of a conflict in the church. Now we come to that question, what's your work? What's your job? What are you supposed to be doing? Well, first of all, that committee needs to be meeting once a quarter at minimum. Please meet regularly. If you have a brand new pastor, you may want to meet more frequently than that, just so you can get to know each other and get to know the church and the community and the needs. But you're in ministry together with the pastor, and you can't do that if you're not at least meeting quarterly. Now, in some of those other districts, none of your districts, but in those other districts, there are churches that only meet, this committee only meets when there's a problem. Again, I know you all don't do that, but I have to mention that because it's part of the training. You need to meet when things are great, so that you know each other, trust each other, love each other when things get hard. And as I tell every church, don't put all your hope in your pastor, because at some point your pastor is going to disappoint you because they're a sinner saved by grace. At the same time, I tell pastors, at some point this church is going to disappoint you, and not because they're mean people, but because they're sinners saved by grace. So we need to have that good communication, quarterly at least. And please, I had one instance where the church met every month, but what happened is created a void. And so first month they'd say, bring all these things the pastor was doing wrong, we want you to work on and correct. So he worked on it all month, got those correct. Next meeting, they weren't interested in talking about those things. They have some new things they need to talk to you about. And the next month, some new things. And the next month, some new things. That's not constructive. That's not healthy. And I would suggest that committee was meeting too often, because what they did is have a void, and what are we going to talk about in this meeting? Well, I've got to ask some people to see who's unhappy so that I know what we can deal with. So it should be times of, hey, Pastor, we need to let you know that you're not speaking loud enough in the sermon. By the way, you really did it. You knocked it out of the park Sunday before last. So affirmation, as well as constructive, working together, critique, to know what people to listen to in the congregation and which people not to listen to in the congregation. You all know who I'm talking about.
Them shoes didn't match that tie.
Yeah, shoes don't match. I can't see him. He's from Oklahoma. Why is he here? All those kinds of things. But in that, to be able to say, there is someone in your church that if Jesus came, they would be unhappy. And it's not that they're bad people. I don't want to say that, but just out of their nature, they criticize. There's also a Miss Nell Van Zant that never says anything but positive things. So if Nell came to me and said, I need to talk to you, here's this one thing, I'm going to listen to Nell, because that's hard for her to do. You can help your pastor know who that is. In other words, if you see your pastor headed towards a brick wall, tell them. The worst thing you could say is, well, I knew that would happen. You can meet at the request of the bishop, the district superintendent, or the chair. In other words, someone in the church can't say, we need to have a PPR meeting. If the PPR agrees that, yeah, okay, we do need to have a meeting, then we can have a meeting. And you need to let the pastor know about it. In fact, the pastor has to be there. You can't have a PPR meeting without the pastor present, unless he or she excuses themselves from the meeting. So there might be occasions say, hey, we'd like to talk to you, but we don't want our John Randolph in the meeting. And I'll say, well, first of all, tell me about that. But then I'll call John and say, they've asked for this. I'm asking you, would you mind stepping out? But as soon as the meeting's over, I am required to call him and say, here's what we talked about. So there's no secret keeping from the pastor. And that's just healthy communication. Let's talk about confidentiality. I can keep confidentiality. It's just those people I talk to that can't. I told them not to tell anybody. Right? The pastor and you need a safe place to talk about tender topics without worrying that it's going to be in the church newsletter the next week. Or even worse, Facebook or Twitter. That includes spouses. Now, for about 5 years, I was a counselor in a counseling center, and then after that, the roles I fulfilled, my wife just knows I don't talk about work. Sorry, can't talk about that. And she's more or less accepted that. How was your day? Fine. What happened? Stuff. But I do that, so one, to protect the person I've talked to, but also to protect her. She may not know, is this something that's public or not public? So that means not go home and talk about it with your spouse, sister, best friend, family member to process. And it's hard. That is not easy to do, not typically how we function things, but absolutely critical in honoring that. And that goes back to, you don't have meetings to talk about the pastor without the pastor present. You don't have meetings to talk about anything else the SPRC might talk about without the pastor present. But it's a bond, and you're there praying for your pastor. You want your pastors to succeed because they are leading you in your call to ministry. And I'd be amiss to say we're all called to ministry, lay and clergy. And so if you're serving on any of these leadership committees, you're living out something God has called you to do. So be faithful in that. How do you calculate the pastor's salary? It first starts with the PPR committee. It doesn't start with the finance committee. It doesn't start with the treasurer. It starts with the PPR committee. And that committee makes a recommendation to finance and in the administrative council or whatever your one board model might be. And then it's the administrative council that decides. We often get that mixed up. Finance committee doesn't decide. They have important information to add to that conversation, but a decision's made to recommend at the administrative council level. And here, listen to this, the charge conference is what sets the pastor's salary. The decider, as one of our presidents once said, is the charge conference. Now, it's good that everybody knows up to the charge conference. Nobody's surprised. Surprises aren't good. But that is often how it's outlined in the Book of Discipline. And it has paragraphs. If you're a discipline nerd and want to go look that up, feel free to. But this is outlined so it's more of a spiritual and missional driven than money driven. Our decisions, folks, and we'll touch on that later, is that our stewardship is critical, but what we do should be missional driven. And believe it or not, churches that have millions of dollars in endowments have trouble with money. You know why? They have different opinions how it ought to be spent. Well, their decision should be missionally driven. So it's not about less or having more, but that mission driven. Do you have a question or a headache, Sandy?
I do. So, you can repeat all this for Mike.
Yeah.
SPRC makes a recommendation, Finance Committee says we can't afford that.
Mm-hmm.
Should that go back to SPRC, or should we have that out at the Administrative Council?
Administrative Council. Because both groups should be represented at the Administrative Council to say, well, why'd you say that salary? Here's why. Why'd you say we don't have it? It's because here's why. And then the Administrative Council makes that recommendation on to charge conference. If you heard Shannon, I want to repeat it. What do you do if finance says we can't pay that? That's all, and they should make another recommendation from finance. Those are worked out together in administrative board, administrative council. Okay? Aren't those lovely pictures?
Yes, those are beautiful.
Consultation. We're getting ready to enter into consultation soon in the Heartland District. This is meant for, as a superintendent, I want to hear from this committee. Please don't take a vote of the congregation of whether the pastor should stay or go. We don't do that. You certainly listen to the congregation, but more importantly, are we doing the mission and ministry that we need to be doing? And sometimes if you do the mission and ministry, people aren't going to like it. So it's the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom of the PPR committee to take all those factors into consideration prayerfully. You're also not the make everybody happy committee. And that's difficult because we like to be nice in the church. But the key piece is, what's God calling us to do? Is this person helping equip us for what God's calling us to do? So it's discernment, spiritual discernment, not counting noses as how many like the pastor and how many don't like the pastor. That consultation happens with your superintendent. In the Heartland District, you have a form. In that form, there is you want the pastor to stay, go, either. And there's an option there that if you want to meet with me personally, I'm willing to do that always. But it's a conversation, and it's not a negotiation. It's consultation. You hear the difference? It's not a negotiation. It's different from everything else that I know in business, of that consultation of how are things going? How are you fulfilling the mission of the church? Is this the leader you need right now to do that? And you tell that to the superintendent. Then in January, Shannon and I and other superintendents will meet with Bishop Graves to say, here's what we're hearing. Here's the consultation requests. And then we prayerfully look at that need of the local church, but also the need of the whole annual conference. I want to bust a myth here. I've always heard, well, Methodist preachers don't stay long. We always move them. One, we move less than the Baptist churches as a whole, okay? But they call it firing. We just call it moving. And I'm not knocking the Baptist church, but we all have our strengths and weaknesses. So let's hear, yes, there are sometimes long-term Baptist pastors, but there are also sometimes long-term Methodist pastors. So we're not looking to move somebody. You know, that requires more work of me if I have to move somebody. But seriously, we do discern the needs of the congregation and what's been expressed, also the needs of the larger conference of that pastor's gifts and abilities. But I want to say, because I've been at the table, one year I took, what's the percentage of people we moved who did not ask for a move? And it's a very low percentage. The majority of pastors, vast majority of pastors who are moved are those the pastor have asked for a move or the church has asked for a move. Or they've said, well, either. We can kind of see some pluses and minuses. Are you hearing me? Sometimes we don't like to be honest with each other because it's hard to say, Pastor, we really needed you to move. Or the pastor said, well, yeah, I really did ask for a move. But hear that from your cabinet, and that's in the past 16 years, vast majority of people who said asked not to be moved aren't moved. But there's a myth out there that, oh, we change them every 2 years. I remember going to a church and they said, well, we know you won't be here long. I was like, how do you know that? Have you talked to the bishop? I don't know. But those are the folks. That's our pictures of the SPRC, the PPR consults. Your superintendent takes that information and consulting with you. We represent that with our bishop. Then we all bring that to the full appointed cabinet. The bishop appoints, cabinet consults with the bishop about those appointments. And that cycle usually is it always seems to be around Easter. But despite our best efforts, we roll out what moves are projected. And if your pastor is moved and you didn't expect that, I'm going to want to come back and consult again to say, hey, I know you didn't want your pastor to move, but you know now that it's a potential of him or her moving. What else do you want me to know about what you need? So that consultation is not just one event or just one form. It's an ongoing. And consultation is going to change a bit this year. At General Conference, as most of you know, the church did something unique around the issues of human sexuality. The church, the General Conference says it will be an option of the local church. So instead of all churches have to line up and be in the same line, doing things the same way, they said, no, we disagree over this topic. So if a church doesn't want to have same-sex weddings in their church, they can do that. If a church doesn't want to receive an LGBTQIA pastor, that's their option. They can express that. So what you'll see in your consultation form is this same question, and while there'll be other questions DSs like to ask, this question, and there's 2 of them, will be the same in every district. And the option will be, and let me see which one I have up. Our building use policy does not allow us to host same-sex weddings. Or, our building policy allows us to host same-sex weddings. And because none of us have been here before, and we're still wrestling with it, you can say, we're still discerning in our church. We're not ready to say. And by the way, this question will be asked every year. Because, if something changes, one way or the other, we want to give flexibility to that, but that's expressing your church's self-option in deciding that. David Garvin will talk a bit about trustees later, but I want to say the best practice is who decides the building policy? Trustees recommend the building policy to the administrative council. So the trustees work on it, but they present that. They're not the deciders of the policy. It has to be a church policy, not just the trustees' policy, if you will. So best practice that we know of right now, none of us have been here before, is trustees develop, administrative council either approves or amends, or it belongs to the administrative council. So when you get this question, and here's about the pastor. And the pastors in the room, we're getting one that says, I am comfortable performing same-sex marriages. I am not comfortable performing same-sex marriages. I am still discerning where I stand on this topic. The question is, why in the world do we ask that? For appointment purposes only. Now hear me carefully. Your church information is staying with the superintendent and the cabinet, so that we don't put a pastor in that's at the polar opposite of where you told us you stand. And the only way we can know is to ask you, and not just say, well, I know they're conservative, or I know they're liberal. No, it's the church's option, not my decision. We need this from the pastor and from the churches for appointment purposes only, so that, and frankly, that's what the cabinet's always been doing that. The cabinet has always had, how do we make the best match between this pastor and this church and what we know about them? We're just continuing that, but there's a new dimension added to that if we just need to know. And pastors, I want to assure you, your information stays with the superintendent and the cabinet. There's never going to be a master list. We're not on some kind of hunt. And I need to say, pastors, the Board of Ordained Ministry will not know your responses on this form unless you choose to tell somebody. This information is not, there's a wall between cabinet and the Board of Ordained Ministry. So this information stays with cabinet. It's not going to be shared with the Board of Ordained Ministry. And as the Board of Ordained Ministry, what we're interested in is, will you abide by the discipline? Do you have Wesleyan theology? The board is not and should not be asking you, well, where do you stand on this issue? We're not going to labeling of, well, liberal or conservative. That's not the Board of Ordained Ministry's job. The Board of Ordained Ministry will be asking pastors, as we certify, credential them, will you abide by the discipline? That's a vow I take. As an elder and as a local pastor, we agree to abide by the discipline. And we want to know, make sure you have a good United Methodist Wesley theology, just to make sure this is the home for you. So no master lists, no gathering of data other than for appointment purposes. So if you say we're not comfortable doing that, ideally we send you someone who's also not going to be doing that. Or, it may be that you don't agree, but you make arrangements of how we're going to work that out. So as a cabinet, we've not been here before. So we might ask this information differently, but this is our best shot of how do we make appointments in under this new book of discipline. And this is our best effort. Also, part of the SPRC's job is to create a culture of call. Now, what does that look like? In our candidacy retreats, we have someone share an elder's call to ministry. We have someone share a deacon's call to ministry. We have someone share a local pastor's call to ministry. And we have a lay person share their call to ministry. Hear me again. We are all called. And perhaps something we need to do better is make sure everyone in the pew knows they are called by name. God is always calling us into ministry. God is always calling us to the least and the lost. God is always calling us to have a closer relationship with Christ. We're all called. But for some reason, I've been in some churches that there's a whole hallway of people who grew up in their church who are now in vocational ministry. Now, granted, they all look constipated and unhappy in their picture, but they're proud. They take pride in. Look who we help nurture in our church who is now leading the church. Where do you think we find our pastors? In your churches. Pastors, leaders come from our churches. So if you feel like we aren't sending good enough pastors, we'll raise some up. I remember saying to one young adult, have you ever thought about vocational ministry? No, I didn't say, God is calling you. And I said, have you ever thought about it? And her eyes lit up and goes, yes, but no one's ever asked me. Lord, have mercy. And all I said is, I see some gifts in you. I don't know God's mind. But if you ever want to talk about it, let me know. I'd be glad to talk to you about it. That's not just the conversation of the pastor. SPRC, this is part of your responsibility. And how do you do that? You engage the young people of your church in ministry. I heard one church recently that has 7-year-olds being the acolytes and ushers for the church. Engage them and give them responsibility. Let them serve in committees, perhaps even chair some of your ministry committees. Let them know that you have a responsibility. Help them hear their calling to whatever God's calling them to do, but to engage them. It's good for the pastor to share his or her call experience. It'd be great if one of you stood up and said, why do I do this? SPRC is hard, finance is hard, trustees is hard, serving the church is hard. Why did I do this? God called me to do it. And so I'm going to do my best for God to share those kinds of stories so that someone might overhear their own call story. And there's another way you can do that. We have folks called the Isaiah interns, an Isaiah internship. It might be even, calling someone named Isaiah. I don't know, but what do I know? But this is an attempt for young adults. And by the way, I share these pictures, one, because I have fun showing their pictures now that they were much younger when they went through the Isaiah Project. But I also say, person on the left, pastor here in Heartland. The young lady on the far right is now a provisional member serving in Western Kentucky. Several of the folks in that center picture are now serving in the church either through vocational ministry or as lay people in their own church. It's an internship that's for 10 weeks. Let me catch up with my notes here. I've touched on that. Don't be afraid to say to somebody, hey, I see some gifts in you. Have you ever thought about? It's not pressure. You're not cornering them. You're not. But, folks, we need the best people. as pastors and church leaders in our churches. And so often we say, well, he's not going to ministry because he's going to be a doctor, or a lawyer, or a chemist, which is great. And you can live out your call that way. But the old phrase used to be, well, if you can do anything else, do it. No, we don't say that. We need the best and brightest to know God is calling, and we'll walk with them. And so don't put him back. Your church can host an Isaiah intern. And on your page, it's easier to see, there is a link to our page. Isaiah internships are for those who are freshmen in college up to seminary and beyond to some point. We give them a sense of, if someone's struggling and I'm not sure I'm called to ministry, Isaiah internship is a perfect place for them because they get to try on ministry for 10 weeks. They have a senior pastor mentor who works with them, talks about ministry, but they'll get to preach, they get to teach, they get to see the church behind the curtain, if you will. They'll be visiting. We've had Isaiah interns assist with funerals. We have all the expenses of pastoral ministry as our tent in that 10 weeks to help them come taste and see. And they may come out of that and say, I am not called to be a pastor in a local church. And we count that as a win. Because we've helped them discern that, okay, God's not calling me to that. And we've just saved them tens of thousands of dollars of seminary debt and expenses to find out that's not where they're called. Or they may come out and as the young woman that was on my far left up here said, she was going to be a teacher. After the Isaiah internship, she changed her major into a call of ministry. And because what happened is that she never wanted to preach. She thought, I never want to stand up in front of people, and found out, hey, I can do that. That wasn't as bad as I thought. And now she's serving our church in Litchfield. So we're not getting in the way of God working. We just want to provide a lab, if you will. And so the intern, as far as what the local church has to provide, is some place for the intern to stay, a safe place for the intern to stay, and the senior pastor has to agree of mentoring that person for 10 weeks. The conference, Board of Ordained Ministry, we've just upped the internship. We're offering fewer internships, but we're offering now that student $8,000 for 10 weeks. And why? Because we want to invest. Going into ministry and training for ministry is expensive. And so we want to help them the best we can. We used to have more and offering $4,000 until we did the math on that and realized we were paying them less than minimum wage for those weeks and not making a great dent in the seminary prices that have gone up. And so this is an experiment of helping people, but also helping that student have some money set aside for seminary education to help them in that way. That is the presentation. I've gone through it quickly. You have the information to take home with you, but I'm wondering if there's any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a booklet for the chair of the SPRC? He doesn't hear me.
Yeah, the microphone's for me.
Is there a booklet available through the SPRC?
One is available, offered by the General Church. The Board of Discipleship offers little pamphlets of describing the role of each committee that you can find online and download. Pray for us as your leaders, because none of us have been here before, so we're attempting to lead faithfully as Christ is calling us.